Welcome to early spring in the garden, when the temperatures are warming up and the weekend looks beautiful ahead and you're itching to get out in the garden, maybe with these or with this. I want to give you a couple of tips so that you feel like a rock star in the garden, knowing what you can cut back this time of year or what you should wait to cut back in the summer. Let's get started. This is the time of year that it's tempting to cut back anything that looks dry and crispy. The rule of thumb to think about is that if it is a plant that grows fresh from the ground every year, like a perennial, you can cut it back all the way to the ground. And in fact, you should. Those brown and crispy leaves during the coldest parts of winter helped insulate the roots and kept those perennials warm. Now, there is still a chance of frost. We're still very early into the earliest parts of early spring, if you want to call it that. But any frost that we get now is most likely not going to be as extreme as the frost we would have gotten earlier in the winter. Oftentimes, when you're whacking back your perennials, you'll see fresh green growth at the bottom, which is basically my favorite thing to see this time of year. It gets me so excited for spring. So brown and crispy things that grow fresh every year from the ground is on the chopping block this time of year. You can cut that all the way down to the ground or wherever you see fresh green growth. Yes, this also includes your grasses. They provided plenty of winter interest earlier, but now that the soil temperatures are warming up, they're going to start sprouting fresh growth, so it's easier to just whack them back this time of year than try to avoid the new growth as it grows in if you wait to prune later in the spring. Another perennial that I like to kind of clean up this time of year is lamb's ear. Technically, this is a semi-evergreen in our area, but over the winter, some of those leaves get pretty rough. If you leave the leaves where they are, they'll just kind of decompose and it probably isn't a big deal, but I have a big issue with slugs in my garden and I find they really love hanging out in those gross, nasty leaves this time of year. I'm just using my hands to comb out the gross, soggy leaves, and if there are any kind of shoots that are getting a little long and leggy, I will cut them back to the new fresh growth. I know it doesn't look like I'm removing much, but this is actually how many soggy leaves I've removed from this small patch of lamb's ear. Now, the brown and crispy rule only applies to things like perennials and grasses. Those are going to be things that start over every year growing fresh from the ground. Your shrubs, those are not going to start growing from the ground. So the rule of thumb for shrubs is a little bit different. Behind me is a hydrangea, and I feel like that's one of the most confusing shrubs for homeowners to figure out when to prune and when not to prune. And that's because there are a couple of different types of hydrangeas, some that should be pruned this time of year, and others, if you prune them now, will not bloom for you at all this spring. So if you don't know what type of hydrangea you have, say you just moved into your home or you weren't really paying attention this last summer, I would err on the side of not pruning hydrangeas at all. Even if you don't prune the hydrangeas that can be pruned this time of year, they will still bloom beautifully for you this year, and you'll be able to note and figure out which type you have so that you know when to prune next year. Generally, the pink and blue hydrangeas are the types of hydrangeas that you don't need to prune at all. These are the types of hydrangeas that set buds on the branches that were grown last year. So for these hydrangeas, if you want to clean them up, just go ahead and cut off the flowers right above a set of leaves, or leave them as the hydrangeas start leafing out and growing this year. They'll shed the old flower heads from last year. So it's completely up to you. Hydrangea pruning is a topic that really deserves its own video. So in this video, I'll just caution you that the brown and crispy rule does not apply to shrubs like hydrangeas. And if you want an in-depth hydrangea pruning tutorial, go ahead and click this video right here to learn more about the types of hydrangeas and when to prune them. This right here is a reason why I think people get confused about gardening and drop it altogether, because this looks like a shrub, but it's actually a perennial. This is the perennial hibiscus, which grows like a shrub. These branches are woody like a shrub, but every year it starts fresh, growing its new growth from the ground. So if you recently moved into your home and you don't know what you have, it's much easier to identify what you have in your garden in spring or summer when they're in bloom than right now where everything just kind of looks like a brown and crispy twig. So if you don't know that you have hibiscus growing in your garden, just wait a season so you know for next year. But if you do know you have hibiscus, you can go ahead and cut it all the way back to the ground. If you have a couple of shrubs that still have leaves on them, they're evergreen and they're looking a little wonky this year, take a closer look and inspect them before cutting them back this time of year. This is an azalea, and if you look up close, you can see all of the buds on it. We are just a couple of weeks, maybe a month away from beautiful blooms. If I cut and shape this back this time of year, I will be removing all of those blooms. Fortunately, this is an azalea that blooms twice a year, so I'll still get blooms in the fall, but preferably the best time of year to cut back shrubs that are wonky in shape are to wait for them to bloom, and then after they bloom, that's your sign to cut them back. If you cut any type of shrub after it's done blooming, there's no chance that you're cutting off next year's blooms. On the other hand, if you're pruning back any sort of shrub while it's not blooming, there's a chance that it's the type of shrub that creates blooms on branches that it made last year. So for me, the rule of thumb is after something blooms, that's when I cut it back if I need to shape it. And also that's when I fertilize it. That way it has all of the energy and nutrients that it needs to create a beautiful flower show for you next year. Evergreen shrubs like conifers, boxwoods, or hollies, these are shrubs that you can cut at any time into almost any shape that you want. Since they don't really flower, there's no risk of cutting them back at the wrong time. If you do cut them back right before extreme conditions, they might make some brown tips and be a little unhappy with you, but they will recover just fine. So hopefully that helps you feel a little bit more confident on which shrubs you can cut back now and which shrubs it makes more sense to wait until after they bloom to cut back. The last category of shrubs you might have in your landscape that we prune back this time of year is roses. And both luckily and unluckily for you, roses are really easy to identify in the landscape because they'll impale you as you cut them. So if you're smart, you will prune roses with protection. But because I am not smart, I'll demonstrate how to prune roses with my bare hands, but be smarter than me and get protection when you're pruning your roses. And while roses might seem intimidating, you really only need to know these 3 things to be an expert rose pruner. Here's all you need to remember. The first one is easy. Branches that are silvery or gray, those are dead branches and those do nothing for our shrub, so go ahead and remove those. Also, any branches that are thinner than the width of a pencil, those are not really strong enough to hold up blooms and can also be removed. What we're trying to do is make sure our rose has really good airflow, which will help minimize diseases later in the season. I like to prune most branches to about 2 feet tall, and where you prune on roses matters. This is a bud, and you're looking for a bud that faces outside of the rose. We are going to be making our pruning cut above the bud, and whichever direction the bud faces is the direction that the branch is going to grow in. We're also going to be making the cut at a 45-degree angle, and you're cutting away from the bud. That way, when it rains, water will run off away from the bud. And that's really all there is to rose pruning this time of year. So now that the weather is warming up and you are armed with the knowledge to know what to cut back this time of year and what to wait on, I hope you have an amazing weekend out in the garden, and I will see you in the next video.